You're watching Economics Amplified, the latest thinking on the biggest issues from UChicago's Becker Friedman Institute.
This is some of this work I've done with Kevin, so there's sort of joint attribution there. So I want to talk about inequality today. So here are my goals. I want to document the increase in inequality, earnings inequality in the United States, and then I want to interpret it within this framework of human capital investment. That is, who acquires skills, how many skills do they acquire, and how do they use their skills in the labor market. And then we're going to use this framework, we're going to put it in a context of economic growth, and then we're going to use the framework to evaluate some possible solutions to rising inequality. And I put solutions in quote because not everybody would think that rising inequality is a problem. So we'll just take it as a fact today. Now, so here's some motivating stuff to think about what I believe is really behind, or what we believe is really behind the increase in inequality in the United States and also in developed countries. So the first one, a friend of mine was the CEO, just stepped down as the CEO of ArcelorMittal, the big steel company. And I told him that I tell my students that in the 1980s it took 2 person-hours of labor time to produce a ton of steel. And he said, no, Bob, you are wrong. And it only takes 1. So, I was only off by 100%, which is not a bad mistake for an economist. And, but that means that there's 11 person-hours, unless we want a whole bunch more steel stuff, which has to do with elasticity of demand. Unless we want whole lot more steel, there are 11 person-hours in that ton of steel that got to go find something else to do. And that has a lot to do with the rise in inequality, because the people who used to make that steel were the guys who carried the lunch bucket down to the steel mill. And they were at the median, or maybe a little bit below the median of the income distribution. Last week, the boxer Floyd Mayweather earned $120 million. I regret to say I contributed to that, because my neighbor asked that, would I come watch with him? So we split the $100 that you would pay to have it in your house. Now, I think back to when I watched boxing matches when I was a kid, and I watched Muhammad Ali fight Leon Spinks. It was just on network TV. You press the button on your TV, you watch the thing. Well, now he can collect $120 million for that service because the technology is there for us all to watch it. And the technology is there to exclude us if we don't pay. And so the very best person in this particular field, boxing, gets to collect an enormous amount more than what he ever collected in the past. So that's got a lot to do with the same element of technical change that I was talking about. My late and lamented colleague, Sherwin Rosen, wrote a paper about that called The Economics of Superstars, why the people at the very top of the talent distribution are earning so much more than they could before, because the span of their productivity is so much broader than it was before, and they can collect on it. So rock stars collect more than they did before. Athletes, CEOs. Often when you hear people talk about CEOs, they say, well, I understand effectively what they say is, I understand athletes, I understand rock stars, but CEOs, that must be a conspiracy. But the span of their productivity is so much bigger than it was before. Now, my third point there has to do with, is personal. I grew up way long time ago from your perspective. So I grew up in the 1960s and early 1970s. My parents didn't go to college. They didn't much care whether I went to college. They wouldn't have dreamed of asking me whether I'd done my homework. Much less would they have dreamed of helping me to do it. So, and I worked in a grocery store, and if I wanted to work in a grocery store, that was fine with them. Now you think about parents today. I spent 20 years on the lab school board, the private school next door. How obsessed everybody is, and not only the parents are obsessed, but the kids are obsessed. And then, more so than ever before, the talented are marrying the talented. There's a lot more sort of mating on talent than there was before. And those people are getting married later. There's a lot more search that goes on to find the right match. And they produce little bundles of human capital like themselves. And so they pass their talent on to the future, including all their neuroses for having to get higher in the income distribution. So those are the things I want. That's sort of the background of what I'm going to talk about. Now, I have a lot of slides. I got equations and stuff. And we're going to kind of skip the details of the equations, but I'm going to point out some interesting features of them as we go. So here's some facts about rising inequality. Since 1980, the premium for graduating college has roughly doubled. In fact, it was going down until about 1980. And right in 1980, a friend of mine at Harvard wrote a book called The Overeducated American. The argument being that so many people were like me had gone to college that the baby boom cohorts coming out of college were huge relative to past quantities of skilled labor, and the returns to skill were going down. And he thought that too many people were going. College counselors were making a mistake telling people to go to college. And no sooner did the ink dry than, as you'll see, the returns turned right around and roughly quadrupled over the next 20 years, which is a large part of the reason why you guys are all here, because the returns to investing in skill are so much higher today than they were in the past. Now, that reflects a general increase in the price of skills. It's not just the returns to education have gone up, but inequality has increased across the income distribution. So, yeah, the 99th percentile makes more than the 90th percentile, but 90 makes more than 80, and 80 makes more than 70, and 40 makes more than 30. Not only do they make more, but the premium for being higher in the income distribution has gone up. So income inequality has gone up all across the distribution. So it's all across the wage and income distributions, and for virtually all measurable forms of skill. And then the growth in the value of education and other forms of human capital has occurred despite the fact that there's a lot more of you bundles of human capital around. That the quantity of people who are fairly highly skilled is much higher than it was in the past. So we argue that that supply has not kept pace with demand, and so the relative price of skill has been going up. And then looking ahead, if we want to think about things that will actually reduce the returns to skill, reduce that element of inequality, it's likely to come from the supply side if that can be achieved. The problem, though, is that the production of skill, investment in human capital, the number of people who are measurably skilled stalled after about 1980, especially among men. And I'm going to show you those charts. So demand was rising, but supply stalled, and hence the price went up. Pretty simple economics. So here's our main themes. Rising inequality reflects a growing demand for skills that economists like to call skill-biased technical change, that it's biased in favor of highly skilled individuals. So the people who can benefit from information technology and those other advances are mainly high up in the talent distribution, the skill distribution, and their relative earnings have risen. Human capital supply has failed to keep pace with demand, and frankly, we're kind of pessimistic about the near-term future of catching up with internal growth, at least, of human capital, which might point to immigration as a source of increasing supply, because we haven't done a very good job of keeping up with production of human capital in the United States, by which I mean investment in human capital. Inequality, though, is the symptom of this. It's not the disease. The disease is a relative scarcity of skills compared to what we had in the past, and then solutions that seek to treat the symptom rather than the disease is likely to make the real underlying disease worse, that makes skills even more scarce if you try to, say, compress the wage distribution by capping the returns to skill. And then if I have time, I'll talk about how this human capital slowdown has the effect of reducing economic growth. And the intuition behind that is that when technical change is skill biased, it means that the technology that's occurring is most applicable to what? To the most skilled individuals. And if production of human capital slows down and the share of those individuals in the labor force declines, then we're going to have less economic growth than we otherwise would have because we have fewer people who can take advantage of that increase in demand. So then but we also emphasize these feedback effects. The skilled invest more in themselves because the returns are higher. So for a given level of, say, innate talent, ability, the returns to the price of skill is higher. So those who have that high ability invest more in themselves. That tends to exacerbate inequality because they have more human capital than they otherwise would have. So and not only do they have more skills, they use them intensively. So the intensity with which you use your skills and the amount of skills you have are what economists call complements. The more skills I have, the greater the returns are to using them intensively. And the more intensively I use them, the more skills I want to get in order to increase my earning power. And then I have a little quote here from Jim Heckman that I want to emphasize because it really points to the long-term issues involved, that these things evolve over decades and decades, where he says, children in affluent homes are bathed in cognitive and financial resources that effectively reduce their cost of acquiring human capital. And this is where I come back to the point I was talking about before. All these talented parents are producing talented offspring, and then they're looking over their shoulders all the time to make sure that they invest in human capital. Why? Because they know what the returns are these days. And my parents didn't care so much because the returns were so doggone low. Now parents are all over their kids, and their kids are all over themselves, feeling the pressure to go out and succeed because the returns to education and talent are so high. So the solutions I want to emphasize again that ignore that central role of supply are going to increase underlying scarcity, which is really the root cause of this thing that we see. So here's some, and by the way, if you have a question, just jump on in. So here's some facts about rising returns to skills. What I have up here is the ratio of the earnings of college graduates to high school graduates. When I say college graduates, I mean people who in the data that we have exactly 16 years of schooling. Back when I came out of graduate school, the returns to education were at a record low. So when I started here at the University of Chicago, I got the market wage for going to a good place, which was a 9-month salary, I'm not making this up, of $17,500. And if you got some summer money, you could get it up to around 20 or 21. All right? Now we hire assistant professors, at least in the business school here, for over, and these are nominal dollars, I know, but you can do the deflation in your head, for like $120,000, even higher. So it's a really big change in that ratio. And if you see here what happened, we went to from about a 20% premium when my friend wrote his book. And now where are we up here? It's up over 60%. So that relative premium has tripled over the period of the data. And then if I look at you guys who get to go in the upper curve, because you'll have postgraduate education, you see that people with postgraduate education have been rising even faster relative to those, to high school graduates. So that this is part and parcel of what we see in the return, in the evolution of inequality in the United States. Now I'll show you here's some information about across the income distribution. I'm going to show you men and women. So what you'll notice here is these are the people at the 10th percentile of the wage distribution. And these are people I've made it a kind of a select group. These are the people who basically work full-time. They work more than 30 weeks a year. They work more than 30 hours a week. And at the bottom of the wage distribution, the people in the 10th percentile, what you notice that men is pretty flat. Their wages aren't rising much at all. And then we go up to the top. We went up to the 95th percentile here. And you'll notice that, yeah, they earn more, but they earn more. And it all started to happen around 1980, the same time I showed you about the change in the returns to schooling. But you see that it's been spreading out across the income distribution, and it happened for women too. So that their rate, they had higher rates of growth in every percentile of the wage distribution. Women have been catching up to men, and we'll show you some dimensions in which they've passed men. But the acceleration in their income growth occurred at the top of their income distribution, and it also took off right around 1980. So here's another summary of those facts that shows you percentage growth between roughly 1970 and 2010, think of it that way. Percentage growth in real wages by percentiles of the wage distribution. And the men at the bottom of the wage distribution basically had no real income growth. And men at the top had their wages grow by about 60 log points, so over 60%, well over 60% over that top period of time. Women grew faster at every percentile of their wage distribution, but the same phenomenon is there. The returns to skill as measured by where you are in the income distribution grew fastest for people at the top, much faster for people at the top than for people at the bottom. So that's our problem. Let's not call it a problem. I broke my own rule there. That's our thing of income inequality, all right? That's what's been going on, and we want to know why it's been going on. You know, when the returns went up, how did people respond? Well, here I'm showing you just average weekly hours by those people at different percentiles of the income distribution and how they changed over time. And what you notice is this is for men. For the guys at the bottom, it used to be, well, across the income distribution, these relative full-time workers, the guys who were working more than 30 hours a week, it was fairly flat, except at the top it turned up. Guys who earned more worked a little harder. But now the relationship between where you are in the income distribution and how many hours you work is even stronger. So the increase in labor supply came at the top, and there was actually a reduction in labor supply that came at the bottom of the income distribution, where wages were either stagnant or in some cases even falling. If you look at the story for women, same story. It was pretty flat across percentiles of the income distribution back in 1970, 72, and now there's a strong relationship between where you are, what percentile of the income distribution you're in, and how many hours per week you're working. So we're going to put this in a great growth framework. So we're going to start with a basic model of economic growth where output depends on how much skilled human capital there is to be applied. We're going to simplify and really have two types of human capital. There's skilled human capital, there's less skilled human capital, or I'll be politically incorrect and call it unskilled human capital. There's capital, that's K, because we use C for cost, so we use K for capital. And then there's technology. And those are the things that determine the rate of output at any point in time. And then corresponding to those three inputs, skilled human capital, unskilled human capital, and capital, there are three factor prices, and we'll call them RU, RS, and RK, and they're all measured in real terms. So what does all that mean? The technology improves over time, and that's what raises output. So when you guys took price theory from whoever you took price theory from, the production possibility frontier shifting out because we learn new tricks, we learn how to do new things. And that's the nature of economic growth, but we're going to say that the nature of the technological progress has had a particular form, and that it has favored skilled labor relative to unskilled labor. Now that's really summarizing some other stuff that could have happened. It could be that certain types of capital got cheaper, and that capital is more complementary with skilled labor. This has been found for a long time that capital is more complementary with skilled labor than with unskilled labor. So when you got more capital, it raises the marginal product of skilled folks more than it raises the marginal product of unskilled folks. So the bottom line down here is that the ratio of marginal productivities for skilled people is rising either because of technological change or just because we're getting more capital for the human capital to work with, possibly because capital got cheaper. Now in equilibrium, what's going to happen is that this physical capital is going to be elastically supplied. That is, funds can come from anywhere, and capital wants to get a competitive rate of return. So the equilibrium return to capital is going to be relatively constant. But this technical change in growth in physical capital raised the relative demand for skilled folks. That raises their relative prices unless supply of human capital keeps up. So the growth in technology, physical capital, and human capital drive increases in growth of output, so per capita income. That's where economic growth comes from. And then the changes in the relative returns to skilled and unskilled, and that's this wage ratio. You can think of it as a shorthand. Think of it as like the college-high school wage ratio. RS over RU is going to depend on the growth in the relative supply of skilled relative to unskilled people compared to the growth in the demand for those people. We don't need this. It just shows that economic growth has just been rolling along. Fairly balanced growth. Okay, this is important. So the equation at the top tells us how relative wages respond to two things in this simplified model. The first term up there, the change in the log of B sub S, that's skill bias technical change. And when we think about this B, it's like when skill bias technological change happens, it means that each of you skilled people have more units of whatever you do. So that your productivity, you have more units of skill to spread around. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the relative price of skill is going to go up, because you got more of them. So when is it going to rise? It's going to rise when the demand for what you are selling is price elastic. If it was really price inelastic, it would drive prices down. But it turns out that sigma up there is called the elasticity of substitution between skilled people and unskilled people. Best estimates are it's around the range of 1.5 to 2. It's bigger than 1. So skill bias technological change, absent changes in relative supply, are going to cause the price of skills to go up. And that's what's driving inequality. On the other hand, over here, if the quantity of skilled people rises relative to unskilled people, that's an increase in supply. That would cause the relative price of skill to go down. So the fight is between those two forces. Skill bias technological change is happening, and it's causing the premium to go up. And skill investment in skills is driving S over U. That's the increase in supply. And if the first one beats the second one, then RS over RU is going to rise, and inequality is going to rise along with it. So here's our simple model of growing demand. We have relative demand for skill grows steadily over time. That's the skill bias technological change. This is the simplified way of thinking of what's going on in the world. But there's changes in the factor ratio drive the returns to skill and the skill premium. That was the second part of that equation I put up there just a minute ago. Supply grows faster than demand, the skill premium falls. That's what happened in the 1970s. In my generation, huge fractions of our cohort went to college. Why? Well, for guys, it was because there was a war going on, and you got to get out of it if you went to college, and you got a deferment. And so we had record proportions of people entering the labor force. But if demand grows faster than supply, the skill premium is going to rise, and that's basically what's happened from 1980 onward. So here's our equilibrium growth model. There's physical capital deepening, as in any neoclassical model. And then human capital deepening is in response to technology and physical capital deepening. That means we're getting more human capital per unit of bodies and things like that. So human capital investment has been rising as a share of output in the labor force, but there's no reason for us to suspect that the supply of human capital will always be sufficient to maintain this skill price ratio, RS over RU, at some constant level. And so that's the theme that's behind rising inequality. So and then there's the supply response. And here's what I want to emphasize. Here's the way we set it up. There's two skill types in our simplified world. There's just S's and U's. And so people can decide based on their talents, do I want to be an S? Think of it as going to college. Or do I want to just stay a U? And then, so NJ is the number of individuals in each group. And that depends on your investment, your decision to invest in becoming either a type S person or a type U person. The S's work in offices, the U's work on assembly lines, that kind of thing. And then there's the human capital you get once you've decided to be whether you're going to be an S over a U. So the subscript J on there is either an S over a U. So once I've decided to be an S, I can really work hard and get a lot of type S human capital. And that's going to depend on my ability to acquire that human capital. That's A. So among those who are S, how much human capital they acquire, and that reflects individual and family, those generational decisions where parents are pressuring their kids and they're telling them what the world's going to be like when they get thrown out of the house and things like that. And then there's the intensity of use of that human capital. Because once I've got my human capital, I got to decide what to do with it. I can apply it for a lot of hours or a lot of weeks per year or a few. But when the price is high, I want to apply it a lot. And when I've got a lot of it, I want to apply it a lot because the returns are even going to be higher. So once that H is chosen, how intensively is it employed? And it doesn't just incorporate effort or time worked. You can think of it also as, well, do I want to be a college professor or an investment banker? And being an investment banker is not so pleasant, but when the returns are high, you might want to stop being a historian and become an investment banker. So the way you apply your human capital, your occupational choice, is also in this shorthand model embedded in that. And then once a person of ability A has chosen H and T, the amount of human capital that's actually offered on the labor market by that person is the product of how intensively you use it and how many units you got. And then if I multiply that by the price of human capital, that R, that tells me how much money you earn. So, and then when we look in the aggregate, remember when we looked at that equation that said when the relative supply goes up, the relative price goes down in proportion to 1 over that elasticity of substitution. Then the aggregate factor ratio depends on how many people became type S's and the average amount of human capital each one of us is applying in the labor market, their Z, and the average amount and the number of unskilled people and the amount of human capital they're applying in the labor market. So that's where the total quantity of relative quantities of human capital come from. So how do we respond? Given the rental prices of human capital and our talents, our innate talents for getting human capital, a skill group is individuals choose whether to belong to which skill group, S or U. Then they decide, given their S or U, how much human capital they're going to have, and then they're going to decide on their effort, and then you could admire that equation at the bottom at your leisure. But what it says is I want to maximize the earnings that I get net of my costs of producing the human capital and working hard. So, oh God, now this gets really complicated, doesn't it? But all it says is people are making these choices. And they have to decide how much human capital to get, how intensively to use it. And what occurs here is when the price is high, when the price of, say, skilled human capital is high, we acquire more of it. And when the price of skilled human capital is high, I actually use it more intensively too. And an important point that's on the bottom of this slide, forget about the math, is that there's a positive feedback from complementarity. Because remember, H and T got multiplied together. So the more H I got, the higher the return to working a little harder. And the harder I work, the higher the return to getting a little bit more human capital. So there's this complementarity that occurs. Human capital is more valuable when I'm going to use it a lot, and it's more valuable to use it a lot when I got more human capital. And that's going to turn out to be a feature that makes, for given R and S, makes inequality spread out even more. Because when fewer people become S's or U's, the returns are high, people like you guys respond by working harder and acquiring even more skills, and that makes observed inequality higher than it otherwise would be. And we'll skip over this. So here's what happens at the end of the day. By how much does the skill ratio change in response to this change in the relative price? Well, it depends on two things. There's an intensive margin where the high ability people acquire more human capital and work harder. That's that Greek letter eta in there. And then there's an extensive margin on which people decide to enter the type S type of skill. And those are the marginal people, the people who would have been a U, but now the returns are higher, so they decide to become an S. and join the S ranks. And that was what was going on for a long period of time, as we're going to see in a minute, that more and more people were joining the S ranks and supply was keeping up for a long time. And then this other piece over here is exogenous growth in skill supply, say by immigration, or we're reducing the cost of getting people to college or whatever. So, but the behavioral responses are in brackets there. So the extensive margin, think of it this way. When you took price theory and we drew this picture on the board, we said when the demand of wheat goes up, all the wheat farmers want to produce more, unless there's more wheat farmers that come in. And so if enough wheat farmers come in and the supply of wheat's perfectly elastic, the price of wheat doesn't go up. But if not so many wheat farmers can come in, then all the wheat farmers who are in produce really hard. And the price is going to be high, so each wheat farmer is producing a lot more than they otherwise would be doing. This is exactly what people are doing with their human capital. The people who are skilled are the wheat farmers who are in, and if you can't get any more wheat farmers in, the price is going to be high, and they're going to produce human capital and use it like crazy, and that makes inequality bigger than it otherwise would have been. So the key results are that for both types, the greater returns increase investment. But there's this positive feedback between H and T, between the amount of human capital people have and the intensity with which they use it. The more you work, the more you invest. The more you invest, the more you work. So increased T can also increase W to the extent that T captures elements other than time. That's the occupational choice point that I was making. So at the individual level, increases in R are magnified, if you will, by the way people respond through their H and their T decisions about how many units of human capital have and how to use them. So when you look at inequality, what happens? There's two offsetting effects. So here's our friend, technical change. And I said this guy's bigger than 1. So this whole thing in brackets there is positive, indicating that an increase in skill bias technological change that raises the relative demand for skill causes the skill premium to go up. And then we have this eta term in here. What is that? That's the people investing in human capital and making it more and using it more intensively. That causes relative earnings between two people at different parts of the skill distribution to widen, because the type S person is responding by producing a lot more, acquiring a lot more human capital and using it more intensively, spreading it out. But on the other hand, there's this other margin where we can get more S, not by having each one of you acquiring more units of type S human capital, but by getting more people who are S's. So the people who switch from being unskilled high school graduates to being skilled college graduates. If that margin's really elastic, then inequality is not going to rise very much. And so some of you are probably guessing what the end of the story is. For a long time, we had a lot of people come, the margin where people could become skilled, join the skilled ranks, was highly elastic. So this term was pretty doggone big, so this didn't increase so much. But when this stalls, then this matters a lot. And so inequality is going to rise because people respond to the stalling of the number of bodies coming in to be skilled by, if you're lucky enough to be one of the skilled, you acquire even more human capital and you use it more intensively, and your parents yell at you and things like that. So the impact on inequality is that the evidence indicates that demand is elastic. So skill bias technological change raises the premium. While all of increasing the number, the intensity, and the amount of human capital per person, all of those increase the relative supply. Those serve to compensate for the change in the demand, and they reduce the skill premium the more elastic they are. They have very different effects on inequality. The supply response on the extensive margin, the number of bodies coming in, like the number of farmers coming into the wheat market after demand goes up, that tends to drive prices down to reduce inequality. But on the extensive margin, the supply response, or the intensive margin, the supply responses from H and T make inequality bigger. So let's see what happened. Oh, got a little more here. The magnitude of the extensive margin response of human capital investment is critical then. We want to understand what that does, because it's something that makes inequality bigger precisely in response to incentives, and it is a supply response. So what do the data say about the supply responses? There's substantial evidence for a supply response. People invest when the returns are high. At least they try. Over much of the 20th century, the supply response came from the extensive margin, and it was sufficient to keep the relative price of skills fairly stable, or even declining over some periods. So there was a vast increase in the supply of educated labor. But over the past 3 decades, that extensive margin has stalled, especially for men. Women are doing better, but especially for young men. And that's caused the skill premium to sharply rise. So here's some facts. For a long time, I used to show only part of this graph because I didn't think I thought it was dispositive, and it's not. If you look here at the blue line and the red line, this is the college high school wage premium. That's that thing that was shooting way up after 1980. And this is men that I have up here. And then the red line is the fraction of men from each high school cohort. So this would be the people who graduated from high school. They were 18 years old in 1980. The fraction of people from each high school cohort that has at least 1 year of college. Now, if you're doing this on the board in your microeconomics price theory class, you'd say the returns went up, people should invest more. And they did. So the higher the returns that occurred after 1980, the larger the fraction of people who have at least 1 year of college. So they're going and they're trying. But then you look at what happened to those who actually have more than 4 years of college. That is, they graduated. That didn't go up by much at all in response to the increase in returns. So there's this sort of intent to invest, or attempt to invest, it looks like, but it's not as successful as you would think given the increase in the relative price of skills. Here it is for women, much closer correspondence. When the returns went up, women entered the labor force, they invested more, and both 4 years of college and 1 to 3 years of college have increased, kind of in step with the returns. So to the extent that we're picking up people who are skilled, contributing to the skill S over U ratio, it's mainly coming on the female margin. If I were giving this talk back in 1970, everybody would be male in the room, and they'd be smoking and stuff like that. Because the returns to human capital were low, who cares how long you lived, right? So here's looking back over long periods of time. So we were able to take the data and say, okay, well, when were you born? When were you 18? What fraction of the people in each of those cohorts, all the way back to 1916, reported that they were college graduates. So here's men who have more than at least 4 years of college by cohort. And here's the baby boom generation charging in to college in the 1960s and 1970s. And then it just stops. So the fraction of men by cohort kind of stalls around 30%, whereas women continues to rise, although it continues to rise. Women with some college continues to go up. Men with some college, it's stalled too. I'll say a little bit more about why that might be happening in a little bit. Here I follow each cohort by their age. And you'll notice, the time when you usually graduate from college is at least by 23. Not that many people have made it in these cohorts. The two that stand out are what? These are 5-year cohorts. I had to get enough bodies in the cells to make a calculation. The two that stand out are 70 and 65 for the men. They wanted to stay out of the war. All right? Then it kind of reverts back to that level. You do see some increase across cohorts, but nothing like for women. Each of the successive cohorts for women is vastly more educated than the one before. When I was a kid, there were two kinds of professional women. They were nurses and teachers, right? And now they're all over the labor force, and they're contributing a lot to the growth in human capital that we do have. Now, why have boys now, since I'm talking about high school, not kept up with the girls? Well, there's the GPAs of high school graduates over time. And the average boy is about 0.2 of a percentage point less than the average girl. And it's been pretty constant over time since about 1990. So it's looking like the girls, at least in terms of their preparation, are more prepared for what's to come, and maybe that contributes to this slowdown in human capital investment or successful human capital investment by the boys. Now, up here, you might say, well, they're doing different things. I'll hark back to when I was a kid, somebody would have said, well, the girls are taking homemaking and they're getting an A, and the boys are taking math and they're getting a B. So now I got first-year GPAs of men and women in four-year colleges and universities. And you don't have to read it in detail. The story is that the women are doing better. And they're not just doing better in like female majors, say the humanities and poetry and stuff like that. In math, they're doing better. So the evidence that women are better prepared for the type of investments that are to come when they're in high school is kind of compelling, and that might be an important reason why we've had this slowdown in human capital development, especially for the margin of men. So what does the slowdown mean? Why has it been insufficient? The numbers graduated from college have not kept up with the numbers entering. The gap in education between entering cohorts and the existing workforce is much smaller than in the past. What do I mean by that? When my cohort was coming out, we were way more educated than the cohorts that were there, or especially the ones who were leaving the labor force. So the skill ratio was going up because the bathtub had more coming in the faucet than going out the drain. But now the cohorts that are coming in basically look like the cohorts that are already there in terms of educational attainment. So growth in S over U is not going up, but skill bias technological change continues apace, so that those wage premia have continued to rise. So unlike the entering 70s, the entering cohorts are not very large. There's poor preparation, it appears, and that kind of accounts for what we see in terms of the skill ratio over time. So some potential policy responses that you've heard about. You could do something with tax policy. Most of these kinds of policies are more aggressively pursued in Europe than they are here. I've spent quite a bit of time in Sweden, where they go to a lot of effort to compress the wage distribution because they have this thing about equality. And it's hard for Americans to get their hands around, but the Swedes are really into it. And so they have centralized bargaining. The employers sit down with representatives of 90% of the workforce. They agree on what relative wages would be and stuff. So they really have compressed their wage distribution. Back around 1970, their inequality was very much like ours. We went up, they went up by less in terms of total overall inequality. We could have wage policies. I just mentioned Sweden. What they do is they don't just do tax policies, they compress that wage distribution. And so there's all these margins on which that's happening. But keep in mind what happens when you do that. If you compress the returns to skill, the returns to investing in skill are a lot smaller than they otherwise would be. So for the same change in demand, the skill bias technological change, skills, the underlying scarcity of skills is even worse than it otherwise would be. We just happen to see that since we have a more flexible labor market, the relative price goes up because it's not constrained, but we have more investment in human capital than in a lot of places. And it comes back again to not just the quantity of human capital. I mean, one of the problems they faced over in Sweden was that when the returns were really compressed, they made the returns to college really low. That, if you're going to go to college, guys didn't care that much to go to college, so they actually paid people to go to college. You got a full-time wage if you would go. And when they went, they studied like Swedish stuff rather than engineering or business or something like that. But then the returns were relaxed a little. They allowed inequality to go up a bit, and more people went to college, and it changed the mix. We could have education reforms. Well, everybody talks about education reforms, but one of the problems that we have is yes, there are issues with our high schools and our lower quality, even colleges. But the larger problem appears to be that people just aren't ready. Maybe we've reached the part of the talent distribution, dare I say it, where supply is just really inelastic. So that at the margin, especially for men, there aren't that many guys who you can pull in, even with a higher price. And if supply is really inelastic, the relative price is going to go up, and that's our inequality. And then we could have immigration reforms. Now, is that going to make Floyd Mayweather earn less for his fight than otherwise? No, because that's a superstar's thing with a guy at the most talented person earns all those returns. That's why LeBron makes so much, and it's why a lot of CEOs make so much. So somebody at the top of the income distribution, simply because of the technology that favors the best person, is going to get that return. But would it matter sort of in where most folks are, down in the 75th to 25th percentile? If you could move some of those people, if you could increase the ratio of those people, since I'm talking about immigration, from the 50th to the 75th, or from the 75th to the 90th, relative to the people in the bottom reaches of the income distribution, that would affect relative prices of skill, and that would reduce inequality some. No, it won't touch the 99.999th percentile, but it'll affect most people, and that'll reduce inequality somewhat. So but what kind of immigration reform do you need? You need skill-biased immigration reform. We got to let skilled people come in greater fractions than you let less skilled people come in if you want to change the overall factor ratio. All right? And I'm sure I got a few more slides. I forget what they look like. But I think I've talked long enough. So, y'all got any questions? The question is there other stuff? I'm going to paraphrase. Is there other stuff going on? And, yeah. One of the things we've been talking about in the last few weeks is trade policy. All right? And in the United States, the stuff we export is relatively skill intensive. And the stuff we import is relatively unskilled intensive. Now, that's not true of all the stuff, right? Because we import Mercedes-Benzes and things like that. But, you used to make your shirts down in South Carolina. Now they come from Indonesia or something, right? So, and that means the people that used to make shirts in South Carolina got it, like the steelworkers, got to find something else to do. So it has very much the same effects, at least in terms of sign, as skill-biased technological change. Now, when people do an empirical horse race between those kinds of things, those two things, they'll generally find that trade does something, but it isn't a whole lot, and it can't account for as big a changes as we see. And it can't account in any way for what happens at the very top regions of the income distribution. That has so much to do with technology. People talk about unionism. It accounts for maybe a little bit, the decline in unionism. A little bit, not very much. So I tell my classes when we talk about this in class that it's kind of like the skill-biased technological change, although there's a lot of direct evidence for it. It's a lot like Sherlock Holmes inference. You line up all the suspects, and when you rule out each one, well, it ain't unions, it ain't trade, it isn't that, it isn't this, the thing that's left must be the culprit, and that's the skill-biased technological change. But you can see direct evidence of it with the computers you guys carry around, in the way firms are organizing production, and so on. His question was, what's my stance? I don't have a stance on it. On the pace of creative destruction. And you all know what creative destruction is. It's that phrase from Schumpeter that said the lever that brings down prices and increases welfare in the long run is not the little supply and demand model you wrote on the board in your micro class. It's this kicking everybody's ass so you can win the monopoly rents. And when you've got an epoch in which technological change really is supplanting faster than in particular areas, then the pace picks up. And the people who have been unfortunately hit hardest by that kind of thing are the people in the bottom parts of the wage distribution. And the people who have been standing there with a grin on their face catching manna from heaven are guys like you and other people at the top of the income distribution. So, and the other thing I tell my students is the price of what we charge here for this education has gone way up. But the returns have gone way up, and that's why the price has gone way up. And we're just charging a competitive price, and it's part of that creative destruction process. So the technological process that we're talking about is part of that creative destruction. Let's put it that way. Okay? Yeah?
In your model, how do you account for the time delay between when you make your investment in human capital today and then the fact that the returns are going to be changing by the time you acquire those?
The truth is, in my model, our model, we ignored that. Okay? We're kind of looking at two long runs. Although we call it an economic growth model, we're not literally talking about the rate of growth between today and tomorrow. We're sort of talking about the steady state rate of growth. And yes, when you make your human capital investment, it's a very forward-looking decision, because when you decide to go to college and acquire those skills, you're making a calculation, a present value calculation that says what's the expectation out into the future. And your expectation out into the future has to account for what everybody else is doing. Because if they're all investing at the same time, that's going to make prices in the future lower. That's a much more complicated model. But what we see in the data is that those returns have continued to rise, and there's not much sign that they're going back down anytime soon. Yes, technological change could displace us. So just the way it happened in the steel mill around the blast furnace, maybe they'll figure out how to manage companies without using so many MBAs. And then, or maybe they'll teach classes without using guys like me. So I'm lucky I got under the wire while I did. He said, I'm curious to know why educational reforms wouldn't work. I think they'll work on the margin. It takes a long time to change S over U, because it's each generation. And if you've got a bunch of U's who you would like to be producing S's in the future, think about families, then they got to be, it takes human capital to make human capital. So if your parents are talented and educated and motivated, then they're going to produce another bundle that looks like them. But that means if you invest in this generation, that's going to have a little impact on the next generation. That's going to have a little impact on the next generation. And those things can play out very slowly.
But isn't that the long-term solution to increasing the supply of human capital? Because it sounded like you were saying that we're tapped. There's no more.
No, I don't. He said, it sounds like I'm saying we're tapped. I don't mean to create that impression. But there's no short-run solution that's going to make that thing come back down to what it was in 1970. If you look at the black-white wage differential over the entire 20th century, every cohort of African Americans had more education and skill than the cohort that came before them. But so their wages were converging and converging and converging over cohorts to that of whites. But it takes generation after generation after generation, and if you look outside, you'll realize we're not there yet. So the gap was way bigger 50, 100 years ago than it is now, but it's still big today. And there's a lot of those families that just aren't prepared to make their kids into S's, and that's a big problem. So it's not just I'm going to take the kid out of the household and I'm going to put him in school and say, okay, read. There's a lot more inputs to that process. So it's not all just in the schools that we have.
Yeah.
One of the interesting aspects about the school quality is, remember what I said professional women did in 1960 and 1970? They are nurses and they were school teachers. Well, they're not school teachers. The best women were school teachers. Dare I say this, that now those people are doing something else. And we've got a different stock of people who are teaching the kids. And that can affect the ability to produce human capital. That's part of your school reform if you want as well.
All these people who are going to college and not graduating, are they getting any return from this? Or would they have been better off becoming an electrician or taking some other shorter education path?
I don't know from these data that most of the people who are ones in the educational attainment after high school went to a junior high school. So there's probably a lot of these guys who are saying, I'm not going on to be a physics major. I'm I've got some vocational degree at a junior welding, whatever it is, okay, that maybe didn't occur in colleges before. Maybe they occurred via apprenticeships and things. But some of them are investing. And if you look at the returns to education, let's just do 1 year of college. People with 13 years of college, they earn more than people with 13 years of schooling. 1 year of college, they earn more than people with 12. And the people with 12 earn more than the people with 11. And it's actually remarkably, there is some sheepskin effect of being a 16 rather than a 15, but that's not that big. It looks like the return per year is pretty constant. It's just gone up by a lot.
So the counselors aren't doing a disservice by pushing more people into college necessarily that maybe aren't going to graduate.
Well, there's a lag there. He just asked the counselors aren't doing a disservice by pushing people into college. When economists have been putting these figures up and making them a little longer for 30 years now. And when inequality went up and first started to go up really sharply in the 1980s, it was news to the college counselors at the high schools, because they'd been telling their kids, just go work in the grocery store, get a job down at the factory. And then because they thought the returns were really low, which they had been in the 70s. So it was kind of an epochal change, a big change that caused the relative price to go up and changed people's strategies, but evidently not by enough. Anybody else? Yeah.
Quick question on the immigration reform. Wouldn't that just push, if you increase the supply for the 75th percentile style of skilled workers, that would close the gap only because it would push the 75th percentile prices down. It wouldn't raise the 25th percentile up, right? So then it would.
Well, no, productivity. Those guys are complements. So the more 75th percentile guys can raise the productivity of as long as they're complements in production. So more 75th percentile guys can raise the relative productivity of the 25th percentile guys. Okay? It's the factor ratio that matters. Any other? That's not always true, but the evidence here indicates that it's close to true. Any others? Thanks for coming.